The baby is coming. The Korean Mafia boss's empire finally has an The contraction hit Adanna so hard she dropped the water glass. It shattered against the marble floor of the executive suite, a bright, splintering sound that cut through every other noise in the room. For one full second, nobody moved. Then Jinwoo was already at her side, his hand under her elbow, his voice flat and fast in a way she'd learned meant he was terrified and refusing to show it. How long, he said, not a question. A demand for data, the same tone he used on Elia's when a server went dark. Adanna gripped the edge of the desk, breathing through her teeth, sweat already at her hairline. Long enough, she managed. Call the wing, now. Hyun was already on the radio before she'd finished the sentence, already moving toward the private elevator, already saying words like secure the corridor and lock the east stairwell. Nobody had told him to. He simply knew, the way he always knew, the way that had almost cost him everything 3 weeks earlier. Outside the tower, the press vans were still parked from Marcus's exposure that morning, their satellite dishes tilted toward the building like something hungry. Inside, the empire that had nearly torn itself apart over a piece of paper.
Who is the mother? Tell us the truth.
Police confirm an active investigation into the chairman.
Stay behind the line.
A stolen access code, and a 4-year-old lie was about to be decided by something no lawyer, no journalist and no board member could fake, buy or hack. Adanna caught Jinwoo's sleeve as the doors opened. Not the private clinic, she said through gritted teeth. The executive wing. Ours, I want this on the record. He didn't argue, he'd learned better than that. The audience needs to know whether Adanna will make it to the wing in time, and what the birth will force into the open before the episode even properly begins. Welcome back to the Empire. If you've been with us since the gala, since the gunshot, since the boardroom, you already know this family doesn't get quiet endings. Hit subscribe now, because the algorithm does not want you to see how this one finishes. Let's go back 3 hours, to the moment everything started to come apart and back together for the last time. 3 hours earlier, the boardroom had emptied out slowly, one polished chair at a time, until only the hum of the ventilation system remained. Jinwoo stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city lights bleed gold across the glass, his reflection layered faintly over the skyline like a second, quieter version of himself. Behind him, on the granite table, Adanna's handbag sat open where it had slipped from her grip during the chaos of the DNA reveal. The pregnancy test was visible in the side pocket, 2 dark red lines catching the overhead light. He hadn't looked away from it in almost a full minute. You saw, Adanna said quietly from the doorway. It wasn't a question either. Jinwoo turned. His face gave away nothing, the same unreadable mask he wore in front of senators and rival bosses alike, which told her more than any expression could have exactly how much this had rattled him. 2 lines, he said, his voice low. I have read boardroom faces for 15 years, Adanna. I have negotiated with men who would rather lose a limb than blink first. I have never once misread a woman's silence. He crossed the room, slow and deliberate, and stopped an arm's length away from her. Why didn't you tell me? Because the moment I did, it stopped being mine, Adanna said, her voice steadier than she felt. It became leverage, evidence, a headline for Han Seo-jin to wave in front of the board. She met his eyes, refusing to look away first. For once in this entire war, I wanted one thing that belonged to just us. Not the Empire, not the contract, just us. Jinwoo said nothing for a long moment. The silence stretched the way it had in the boardroom, the way it had in the car after the gala, the way it always did right before he said something that mattered. Then he reached for her hand, not the boardroom grip, not the photograph pose for the cameras outside. Just her hand, warm and steady around hers. It still does, he said, belong to us. Behind them, the city kept moving, indifferent to the 2 people quietly deciding, for the first time without an audience, what they actually wanted. Elias' voice cracked through the earpiece before either of them could sit down, tight and urgent. You both need to see this, now. They found him in the server room, 3 monitors deep in scrolling code, his mechanical keyboard silent for once. The override that faked the DNA match in the boardroom, he said, not looking up. I finally traced the origin device. He turned to face them and his expression made Adanna's stomach drop before he'd even said it. It wasn't external. It wasn't routed through the internet at all. It came from a device physically inside the boardroom, before the gala even started. Someone in the room, Adanna said slowly. Someone with clearance, Elias confirmed. I need 48 hours to narrow it past the building's own internal network. Jinwoo's jaw tightened, the only visible sign that the words had landed. You have 24. Elias didn't argue. Nobody argued with Jinwoo when his voice dropped that low. He turned back to his screens, and the room filled again with the quiet, relentless click of his keyboard, hunting for whoever had stood close enough to hand Jinwoo's own trust to his enemies. Tae-hyun was waiting outside the private residence floor when they arrived, arms crossed, his expression carrying the particular stillness Adanna had learned to read as bad news, handled carefully. "There's something you need to know before you go up there," he said to Jinwoo, and then after a beat glanced at Adanna too. "Both of you." "Say it," Jinwoo said. "Senator Vance transferred custody of the boy 3 days ago," Tae-hyun said. "Called it insurance in case the paternity claim collapsed and he needed leverage of his own. The boy's been on the 12th floor since Tuesday, under my security, not the senator's." Adanna felt something cold move through her chest. "He's been in this building for 3 days, and nobody told me." "I found out this morning," Tae-hyun said. "I've had 2 men on him since." The elevator doors slid open before Jinwoo could respond. A small boy stood just inside the corridor, hands tucked casually in his pockets, entirely unbothered by the 2 armed guards flanking him on either side. He looked at Jinwoo first, a long, assessing look, the kind adults gave each other across a negotiating table, then at Adanna, then back to Jinwoo, cataloguing something in his small, careful face. "You're taller in person than the photographs," Min-jun said, in a voice far too composed for 4 years old. "Everyone in the security detail talks quieter when you get close. I've been counting. It happened 6 times in the last hour." Nobody had said a single word to him about who Jinwoo was, or why his presence made grown men lower their voices. If a 4-year-old just profiled an entire security detail faster than the board of directors could organize a single meeting, you need to see what he does next. And trust me, it gets him into rooms nobody thought a child could walk into unaccompanied. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because the algorithm will absolutely bury the next escalation if you let it slip past. Drop a comment below. Do you think Min-jun already knows more about this family than the adults standing around him do? Drop your theory below, because we're about to find out how much that kid actually understands. Adanna crouched down to his eye level, the way she'd once have addressed a difficult investor across a table, not a child in a hallway. "I'm Adanna," she said. "I know who you are," Min-jun said, matter of fact. "You're the reason my father stopped shouting in meetings." One of the guards said it, not knowing I could hear through the vent. He tilted his head, studying her the way he'd studied Jinwoo. "Are you going to marry him?" Adanna blinked, caught off guard for the first time all week. That's a very direct question for a 4-year-old. "Grown-ups take too long to say things," Min-jun said, with the weary patience of someone 20 times his age. "I don't have that problem. It wastes time, and Tae-hyun says time is the one thing nobody in this building ever gets back." For the first time in weeks, Adanna laughed, a real one, unguarded, nothing like the practiced smile she wore for cameras. Jinwoo, standing a few feet away, watched the exchange with something dangerously close to softness crossing his face, the kind of expression that would have terrified the entire board if any of them had seen it. "He asks everyone that," Tae-hyun said dryly from the doorway. "He asked me the same question about the head of legal on Tuesday." "What did you tell him?" Adanna asked, still smiling. "I told him some questions weren't mine to answer," Tae-hyun said. "He didn't accept that answer either." By morning, Han Seo-jin was back in the boardroom, a fresh folder in hand and considerably less patience left than she'd arrived with the week before. "The International Division has given you 5 days," she said, sliding the document across the polished granite. "If paternity isn't legally and independently resolved within that window, the shipping license renewal is void. Vanguard loses its entire European corridor." 5 days, Jinwoo repeated flat. "4 now," Seo-jin said, without looking up from her notes. "You spent 1 arguing with me about the wording of the last clause." Adanna leaned forward. "And if we resolve it before the deadline, what happens to the board's confidence in me?" For the first time since she'd arrived, Han Seo-jin's expression shifted, something almost like respect flickering behind the silver-rimmed glasses. "Then you'll have done more for this company's credibility than any PR campaign I've reviewed in a decade," she said. "But I don't deal in hypotheticals, Mrs. Ryu. I deal in deadlines. You have 4 days." Han Seo-jin gathered her folder and left without another word, her heels clicking a brisk rhythm down the corridor. Adanna waited until the door closed behind her before pressing a hand briefly to her stomach, exhaling. "I need to see Dr. Suk," she said. I was supposed to be at the antenatal checkup an hour ago. The ultimatum ran long. Jinwoo didn't argue. He simply fell into step beside her. Then we're already late for something that actually matters. He walked her down to the executive medical wing himself, past the same lab that had once tried to end them both with a fabricated result. Dr. Hana-suk was already reviewing the chart when they came in, and she didn't look up right away. She said to Adanna, gesturing at the exam table without ceremony. She checked the blood pressure cuff readout, then the weight log, then asked without preamble, "How many times this week have you actually kept food down before noon?" "Most days," Adanna said. "That's not an answer." Dr. Suk made a note. "I need a number, not a mood." She glanced at the chart again. "Your blood pressure's elevated from your last visit, not dangerously, but enough that I want to know what changed in the last 5 days. Boardroom," Jinwoo said. Dr. Suk looked at him directly for the first time, unhurried, entirely unbothered by who he was. "Then the boardroom needs to change, not her numbers." She turned back to Adanna. "I want you eating something small every 2 hours, whether you're hungry or not, and I want the nausea logged, not just endured. If it hasn't eased in 2 to 3 more weeks, we run blood work again." "Understood," Adanna said. Dr. Suk removed her glasses and glanced one last time at the chart before setting it aside. "Stress won't determine when this baby arrives," she said calmly, "but it can determine how difficult the journey becomes." "Understood," Adanna replied. For the next few days, that was the rhythm they held to, meals every 2 hours, the nausea logged instead of endured. The boardroom kept at arm's length whenever Jinwoo could manage it. But somewhere below street level, in a cell that had been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of quiet, a burner phone was already lighting up. In his cell, Marcus stared at the burner phone. One of Senator Vance's men had slid through the bars, his voice pure venom down the line. "The hack didn't work," he said. "He's still standing, still married to her, still running the company." "What do you want to do about it?" the voice on the other end asked, flat and cautious. "Call Vanessa Croft," Marcus said, a slow smile spreading across his face in the dark of the cell. "Tell her the child is being held against his will inside Vanguard Tower. Tell her Jinwoo moved him there without his mother's consent, without the courts, without anyone's permission." He leaned his head back against the cold stone wall, satisfaction settling over him like a second skin. "Let's see how many days Jinwoo has left once the entire country believes he's kidnapping a 4-year-old boy." The line went quiet for a moment. Then, "And if it doesn't work, if he gets ahead of it?" Marcus's smile didn't waver. "Then I still get my headline. Either way, everyone in that boardroom remembers my name a little longer." The press conference had been Adanna's idea, get ahead of Marcus's rumor before it could breathe on its own. She hadn't planned on Min-jun walking to the podium microphone entirely unassisted, slipping past Tae-hyun's outstretched hand before anyone could stop him. "My name is Ryu Min-jun," he said, his voice clear and unhurried, carrying easily across the room full of cameras and folding chairs. A ripple went through the assembled reporters. "I am not being held anywhere against my will. I have my own room on the residence floor, my own toys, and I get to choose what we watch after dinner most nights." He turned and looked directly at Vanessa Croft, who stood frozen near the front row with her recorder raised halfway to her mouth. "Is that the question you actually wanted to ask me, or did someone hand you a different one to read this morning?" The room went utterly, completely silent. Somewhere near the back, a photographer's camera clicked once, loud in the stillness. Then a low laugh broke out, and the tension in the room cracked into scattered, disbelieving applause. Jinwoo did not smile in public, ever. He was smiling now, just barely, just at the corner of his mouth, and Adanna caught it before he could smooth it away. Afterward in the car, Min-jun sat swinging his legs, entirely unbothered by what he'd just done. "Did I do it right?" he asked. "You did better than right," Adanna said. "You did it better than the entire legal team could have." Min-jun considered this with obvious satisfaction. "Good," he said. "I don't like it when people talk about me like I'm not in the room." Did you catch that? A 4-year-old just did in 15 seconds what an entire legal team couldn't manage in 5 days, and he did it without anyone feeding him a single line to read. If you want to see how far Min-jun's instincts actually go before this empire finishes being tested, you cannot let this video slip past you. Is he the sharpest character in this whole saga? If you want to keep watching him prove that, the subscribe button's right there, and it costs you nothing but a tap. Tell us in the comments, we might read your theory out loud before the next chapter starts. Adanna found Chloe alone in a hotel suite 2 floors below the press conference, stripped of the composure she'd worn at every public appearance since the gala. Her makeup was gone. Her hands were shaking around a cup of untouched tea. I never wanted any of this, Chloe said, before Adanna had even fully closed the door behind her. Choi came to me first years ago, then my father more recently, once the shipping deal put too much pressure on all of us at once. They told me the boy could be leverage, that it would force Jinwoo to bend, to negotiate, to hand something back to the old guard. Her voice cracked, thin and exhausted. I believed them because believing them was easier than admitting what I actually did 4 years ago and what it cost everyone since. Adanna sat across from her, saying nothing at first, letting the silence do the work silence always did in this family. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Chloe said finally, wiping at her eyes with the back of one trembling hand. I know what I tried to do in that penthouse. I know what the gun almost cost you. She looked up, and for the first time there was nothing performed in her expression at all. I'm asking you not to let that boy grow up the way I did, used by people who called it love because it was easier than calling it what it actually was. Adanna reached across the small table and after a long moment took Chloe's hand. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't friendship, but it was something neither of them had offered the other before. Adanna was still sitting with Chloe's words when her phone buzzed. It was Elia's, a message puppered and was written in 3 words. Come down. Now, she found Junwoo already in the server room when she arrived, standing over Elia's shoulder. Elia's didn't look up. His hands were hovering over the keyboard like he wished he could take back what he was about to say before he'd even said it. It was Heir, he said quietly. He used his own credentials, his own access code. He didn't fake a negative match to hide anything from Ryu Jinwoo. He did it because he was certain the sample itself had already been tampered with before it ever reached that room, and he wanted the board to see a clean result before anyone else could manufacture a dirty one. Jinwoo found Heir on the rooftop an hour later alone, looking out over the harbour the way he had for 15 years of quiet, unglamorous loyalty. You lied to me, Jinwoo said, standing a few feet behind him. I protected you, Heir said, not turning around. The same way I have since we were both young enough to believe it would only ever cost us bruises. That decision was not yours to make, Jinwoo said, but there was no blade in his voice this time, only exhaustion and underneath it, something that had almost broken completely and hadn't quite. You should have told me. Would you have let me act if I had? Heir finally turned, and for the first time in the entire saga his composure cracked just slightly. You were staring at a table with your own name on a lie you didn't write. I wasn't going to stand behind you and do nothing while it burned everything down. Jinwoo said nothing for a long moment. Then he stepped up beside him, and the two of them stood there together, looking out over the same skyline they'd fought to protect since they were teenagers, saying nothing more because nothing more needed saying. No more shortcuts, Jinwoo announced to the assembled board the following morning, his voice carrying easily across the granite table. A new test, an independent lab chosen by Han Seo-jin's office, not mine, a live video feed watched by everyone in this room in real time so no one afterward can claim it was written in a back office by anyone loyal to either side. Han Seo-jin, for the first time in the entire saga, looked almost impressed. Finally, she said, closing her folder. A decision I don't have to argue with you about. The old board member who had once told Jinwoo to step down nodded slowly. This is how your father should have handled things, he said. Perhaps you are becoming something better than him after all. The lab result loaded onto the boardroom screen in real time, no override buried beneath it this time, no hidden line of code scrolling in the background. 0% match, confirmed independently, verified by 3 separate technicians standing visibly on camera. But it was the second line of the report, the one nobody had been looking for, that made Adanna's blood run cold. The original DNA sample on file from the Swiss clinic matched a sealed blood sample logged 4 years earlier under an entirely different name. A name buried 3 layers deep in Marcus Montgomery's own offshore medical records. It was never yours, Elias said quietly, staring at his screen like he wished the data would change if he looked at it long enough. The child, the clinic, the sanatorium stay, Chloe's disappearance from public life for a year. Marcus built himself an heir he could use against you, years before you ever met Adanna. He's been sitting on this the entire time, waiting for the moment it would do the most damage. Stared at the photograph on the file, Min-jun, 4 years old, grinning at some photographer years before either of them had ever met him, and for the first time all season his hands were not entirely steady. He built a weapon, Jinwoo said finally, and raised it as a child, just in case he ever needed to use it. Marcus wasn't reacting to the empire falling apart. He was quietly building his own inside it for 4 straight years before anyone noticed. Did any of you actually call this coming, or did it catch the whole comment section off guard the same way it caught us? If you'd rather find out what happens next for yourself than read it in someone else's comment first, now's a good time to hit that bell. Did you see Marcus coming? Or did this just wreck your entire theory the same way it wrecked us? The evidence went to the prosecutor's office within the hour. Fraud, sabotage, and now paternity concealment, used deliberately to manufacture a corporate succession crisis that had nearly cost Vanguard its entire European operation. Senator Vance arrived at the federal building alone the next morning, his cane tapping an unsteady rhythm against the marble floor, no aides, no cameras arranged in advance. My daughter didn't know the full extent of what he'd done, he told the small crowd of reporters waiting outside, his voice thinner than it had ever sounded in a boardroom. I did. I should have stopped this years ago, the first time I suspected what that child actually was. He didn't look back toward the holding cells as he walked past them. Marcus's sentence, when it came down 2 weeks later, added 12 more years to what he was already serving. There would be no release, no yacht, no second act on a televised debate stage. He had built an empire out of other people's silence, and in the end it was his own silence, finally broken, that buried him completely, which brings us back to where we started. Adanna refused the private clinic. Heir wanted to rush her to the moment the first contraction hit. I am not hiding, she said, gripping the edge of the desk through the pain, sweat at her hairline, her voice steady even as her knees buckled. Not from this, not anymore, not after everything we survived to get here. She delivered on the executive medical floor, the same floor where a fabricated test had once tried to end her family before it had even properly begun. Han Seo-jin, of all people, stood outside the door for 3 straight hours, managing the board's frantic questions in real time, buying every last minute of privacy the couple had left before the news inevitably broke. Chloe, quietly and without being asked, turned away 2 photographers who'd followed the medical convoy from the street below, her one unscripted, unwitnessed act of decency in the entire saga. In the hallway, Min-jun sat very still for the first time since anyone had met him, his small hands folded tightly in his lap, waiting. When the cry finally came, thin and furious and alive, it filled the corridor in a way that no corporate announcement or Mafia show of force ever had. Jinwoo held his daughter for the first time with the same hands that had once slid an encrypted memory drive across a boardroom table in front of 24 investors, and for once in his entire life, those hands didn't need to prove anything to anyone at all. She's real, he said quietly, to no one in particular, staring down at her. She always was, Adanna said, exhausted and smiling. That was never the part anyone needed to fake. Chloe visited once more, briefly, the week before she left the country for good. She knelt in front of Min-jun in the nursery doorway, meeting him at his own eye level the way Adanna once had. You get to stay here, she told him gently. Not because of blood, because they want you here, that's different and it's better. I already knew that, Min-jun said, glancing past her toward the bassinet where his new sister slept. I've known since the press conference. Nobody makes a 4-year-old talk to reporters unless they've already decided he belongs to them. Chloe laughed despite herself, something wet and surprised in the sound. You really don't miss anything, do you? Min-jun said simply. I don't. She looked up at Adanna, standing in the doorway with the baby against her shoulder. You can give him something I never figured out how to give him, Chloe said. Steadiness, a house where nobody's using him for anything. He's already family, Adanna said. That was never actually in question, not for us. 6 months later, the doors to the grand ballroom opened once more. It was the same room where Marcus had once called Adanna Barren, in front of 500 watching guests. The same chandeliers, the same marble floor, the same orchestra tuning quietly in the corner. This time the room was full of the same faces that had whispered about her that night, but nothing about it was performance anymore. Min-jun walked the rings down the aisle himself, refusing help from anyone, greeting 3 separate diplomats by name along the way, and correcting one on the pronunciation of his own title without missing a step. Jinwoo said his vows the way he said everything that actually mattered to him, quietly, and only once, with no need to repeat himself for effect. Adanna didn't wear armor this time, no gold gown built like a shield. She didn't need one anymore. As the room rose into applause around them, Adanna caught Jinwoo's eyes across the small space between them, and for once neither of them needed the room to see anything at all. It was enough that they knew. Elia stood near the back with Tae-hyun, both of them finally fully at ease. Han Seo-jin, seated near the front out of professional obligation more than sentiment, allowed herself the smallest of smiles as the vows concluded. Even Kang Tae-hyun, who had spent 15 years standing quietly behind Jinwoo's shoulder, let himself simply watch, for once instead of scanning the room for threats. Somewhere in that same room, 500 people who had once watched Marcus call her empty were now watching her stand in exactly the life she'd built instead, not because anyone told this story for her, but because she'd lived it. If this is the first time you're seeing this family, you should know it didn't start here. It started with 4 words spoken in this exact ballroom, the night a Mafia boss walked through those doors and told the entire room she wasn't Barren, she was carrying his heir. If you want to understand exactly what that claim cost, and exactly how far it carried them, part 1 is waiting for you, right where this all began. We started that story with a lie loud enough to fill this ballroom. We're ending it with a truth quiet enough to fill a family instead. If you've been here since the very beginning, since the gunshot, since the boardroom, since the bag on the granite table, tell us in the comments below. Which single moment made you finally believe Min-jun had truly become part of this family? We read every last one of them. Thank you for building this empire with us from the very first episode to this one.